centuries, Dostoevsky has been read widely throughout the English-speaking world, but most of us don't realise he should come with a warning. At the heart of one of his most well-loved novels, Notes from Underground, there's a glaring translation error. In the opening lines, the narrator is described as loi, a Russian word imbued with the full moral meaning of wickedness. But the dominant English translation renders it as spiteful, which misses the point that is carried through the rest of the novel. This error is the difference between a theological claim and a psychological one. Spite is a contemptible behaviour, but wickedness reveals something about the colour of the soul. The acclaimed translator Richard Pevere points out the gravity of this, describing that habit of substituting the psychological for the moral, of interpreting a spiritual condition as a kind of behaviour, which has so bedevilled our century. Such a substitution reflects exactly what Dostoevsky was writing against. In his century, the culture had begun to view the soul's disorders as really the mind's. When sin was reduced to a complex, the wicked man needed a doctor rather than a priest. The underground man resists this cultural diminishment. He knows exactly what he is, and exactly what he's due. The Christian tradition, which is inextricable from Dostoevsky's work, understood wickedness as a trap where the will is turned against itself. A wicked man is conscious of the good, but constitutively unable to choose it. This is no psychological quirk, but something much more sinister. It's part of the human condition in which sins are sins and not symptoms. This video is about what Dostoevsky is doing in that basement, and why it matters even more today than when he wrote it. Notes from Underground crystallizes when you understand what was going on in Russia during the 1860s. This period produced a school of thought that Dostoevsky called the Chernyshevskians. This was a movement with its philosophical roots in the utilitarian and materialist traditions coming out of Western Europe, particularly from Bentham, Mill, and the French materialists. Later, its Russian body was formed by writers like Chernyshevsky, followed by Dobrolyubov and Pisarev. The central claim of the movement was radically simple: that human beings, once properly understood, are perfectly rational creatures who act in accordance with their interests, and that the good society is therefore a matter of calculation. Once we work out what it requires to achieve the maximum benefit for the maximum number, we can arrange the conditions accordingly and ostensibly achieve perfection. The so-called Bible of this movement is Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done. Today, it's difficult to read since it is so relentlessly cheerful about the future of humanity, and so brightly optimistic about the utopian nature of rationalism. His hero Rakhmetov is the rational egoist, who knows that his own interests align with the interests of humanity at large, and who therefore lives and acts as if he's a variable in a complicated equation. This calculation forms the bedrock for the Crystal Palace, a world of perfect order where every human need is met and conflict is impossible because it's irrational. The palace's gleaming, transparent walls hide no secrets, and it's a deliberate narrative device for Dostoevsky. Here, there is no wickedness to be ashamed or proud of, and no underground to be discovered. British utilitarianism wasn't the only intellectual bounty being smuggled into Russia from the West. It was joined by the broader Enlightenment confidence in the power of reason to solve the human problem. Expressed in Concord's vision of indefinite human progress, Saint-Simon's technocratic utopianism, and the positivism of Auguste Comte, who proposed that science had covered enough epistemological ground to replace superstition, not just in theory, but in actuality. In other words, the image of the Crystal Palace was a metaphysical representation of the claim that the world is transparent to reason. It stood for the assertion that human nature is knowable and improvable, and that the obstacles to human happiness are technical rather than spiritual. It was a simplification designed to shine. But was it the truth or wishful thinking? Dostoevsky's relationship to this tradition was more complex than his underground man's polemics might suggest. Before his famous arrest, mock execution, and Siberian imprisonment transformed him, he had been a socialist. He knew the glimmer and temptation of the Crystal Palace firsthand, and the underground man's argument against it is deeply rooted in a personal wrestle. He writes, "What Crystal Palace is it then? What have I done wrong? Am I really so weak that I can't improve things?" But where is it written that a man must only want the useful? Where is it written that a man only wants the profitable and the rational? What man needs is exclusively independent wanting, whatever this independence may cost and wherever it may lead. Somewhere small but burning with an intensity he can't ignore, he knows he is more than a piano key. He doesn't want to be a predictable output of a rational input. Dostoevsky tells us that what he really wants is caprice, because in it lies the difference between a person and a calculation. He writes, "If it turned out that to calculate it were possible and I agreed, that is, I agreed to the calculation, why, then I would not be myself any more at all." Here we find the most compact form of his thesis. There is something bigger and more primal going on here than rational interest maximization. The irreducible form of the human being is the will, the ability to choose rational interest maximization or not. Sometimes we act against our own happiness, against reason, without knowing why. Sometimes we defy it just to assert that we're here. The underground man would rather knock over the Crystal Palace than live in it. Not because his basement is bigger or more comfortable, but because it's his own. Isaiah Berlin wrote a famous essay on Tolstoy's view of history, and in it he made a distinction between the fox and the hedgehog. The hedgehog knows one big thing, and the fox knows many things. Chernyshevsky is like Berlin's hedgehog. He knows one big thing, which is that reason and interest, correctly understood, produce the good society, and he arranges everything around the certainty of this idea. The underground man is a fox who can't become a hedgehog because he has experienced too many inconsistencies in the world, and as a consequence has developed too many conflicting perceptions to ever have the certainty of the fox. It's the agony of this conflict that defines his character and his underground existence. But Dostoevsky isn't exactly celebrating the underground resistance. Instead, he's showing us its cruel double face. The underground man is right about the Crystal Palace, but in shedding the naivete of rationalist idealism, he has become blind in a different way. In the second half of the novel, we see him become painfully petty, cruel, and self-sabotaging. He's unable to sustain a real human connection, technically free but paralysed by his own defiance. Chernyshevsky's Crystal Palace is firmly destroyed, but all the underground man can do is sit in the rubble and congratulate himself. It's in the dramatisation of this double failure that we see the unique formal achievement of Notes from Underground. The Crystal Palace and its critic both fail, and the readers are left with no viable moral vantage point. You can't cheer for the palace because it's built on a lie about human nature, and you can't cheer for the underground man either because his freedom is fruitless. Instead, you're left reeling in the shape without substance between the two, crafted by Dostoevsky and intelligible by you alone. The novel's introduction, in Pavir's reading, describes what is in question as the complex reality of the human being, the whole person, the thing itself, and the underground man's problem is that he grasps only half of it. The half that is irreducible will, resistant to calculation. He can't reach the other half, which is the will rightly ordered, the freedom that chooses not caprice but genuine good. He knows what he stands against, but he can't reach what he stands for. Against the theologically coloured backdrop of Dostoevsky's work, this serves as a description of the will without grace. When you're free enough to refuse the Crystal Palace, but not free enough to build anything better, you're caught in the distinctly human trap of the jaded underground. The underground man's critique of liberal rationalism is entirely correct and entirely insufficient. He knows he's meant to be something more than a piano key, but he can't say what it is. For that, he would need to look beyond himself, and his philosophy has sealed him inside. One of the most important moments in the novel is Dostoevsky's account of the underground man's relationship to his own morality. He is morally aware, knowing what is good the way a person with a fever knows their temperature. He can feel it in his body, and says, "The more conscious I was of the good and all of this beautiful and lofty, the deeper I kept sinking into my mire, and the more capable I was of getting completely stuck in it." This is the confession of a man whose moral compass is working perfectly, and yet he finds himself unable to move in the right direction. It's precisely his awareness of the good that causes him to retreat into the wickedness even more fervently. But despite the vice grip the wickedness has on him, he doesn't abandon his moral realism, never once suggesting that the good he fails to choose is a fantasy. Instead, he continues to report on his failure with meticulous precision, as if he were a scientist recording an experiment with the results he doesn't like. This idea cuts against a certain distinction that has been made in most of Western liberal moral philosophy since Kant. It's the one between knowing what is right and doing what is right, resolved by the Kantian claim that a rational being who truly knows the good will choose it. The underground man subverts this claim entirely. He embodies the one who truly knows the good and yet turns his back on it. And he doesn't do it because he's ignorant or because his reasoning is defective. In the framework of the Crystal Palace, he hasn't been given the wrong information about his interests. Rather, it's because he understands that knowledge of the good is not the same as doing good. Kant's moral architecture assumes that once a rational agent has grasped the categorical imperative, they have everything they need to act accordingly. But what it lacks is any account of the condition in which knowledge and will are misaligned, in which the agent sees clearly and acts otherwise. The underground man doesn't fit here, and if we pry a little into our own psychology, we find that neither do we. The Christian theological tradition was expressly designed to address this failure, and from it came a toolbox that the Enlightenment forgot how to use. Why isn't knowing the good enough? Why do we do things we know in our bones are wrong? The theology never claimed that knowing the good was sufficient, and it filled the gap with grace. Transformation, the reorientation of will towards its proper end, was needed too, and it had to come from the outside. In The Underground Man, Dostoevsky is making a case for the theological claim that the human will, when left to its own resources, can't reliably choose what it knows to be best. The condition that we see in The Underground Man has a name. It's called akrosia, which comes from the Greek, translated variously as weakness of will or incontinence. The early Christian philosopher Augustine describes it in his autobiographical work Confessions, as he petitions God, "Lord, grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." Just like the Underground Man, Augustine genuinely desires the good, and yet can't help but want to keep on sinning. Both of them, to their horror and to no surprise, find that the second desire is stronger in practice than the first. As Paul put it in his letter to the Romans, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." This is not the failure of knowledge, but the failure of the will in its most naked form, at a depth that knowledge alone can never reach. The Underground Man is Augustine's secular counterpart, lacking the theological framework that will allow him to be transformed by his experience rather than remain stuck inside it. We can look to Augustine for his diagnosis, but he has no access to Augustine's doctor. It's almost painful to witness the clarity of his moral psychology from the outside, knowing he doesn't have the key to unlock the cage. He tells us, "But the main feature was that this was all in me not as if by chance, but as if it had to be so. As if it were my most normal condition and in no way a sickness or a blight, so that finally I lost any wish to struggle against this blight." The novel shows us what happens to a man's psychology when the theological grounding of morality is ripped out from under him. He loses direction and hope, and the wish to struggle. Conscience survives, but the energy to act on it wavers. The only thing left is the underground, because it's the only place where the conscience, the voice that tells him this is wrong, can speak with no one to hear. This rings true in contemporary society, and it's even more uncomfortable than it seems at first glance. There's a certain kind of intelligent modern person who runs on the default setting of the Underground Man. Someone who is hyper-aware of moral failure, their own and the world's, who can describe the problem in increasingly precise terms, but who doesn't act on their description. We see this play out in politics on both sides. The political left in particular has developed a sophisticated vocabulary for analysing and condemning the structures of oppression and injustice that barricade the modern world. The words they say are often accurate, but the actions they take are consistently insufficient, generating instead what the Underground Man would immediately recognise as the serpent eating its own tail. The actions are fed back into the analysis in an endless refinement of the critique, an infinite regress of language, and a culture of exposure and deconstruction that mistakes the naming of the problem for its resolution. The Underground Man would feel at home on social media, and he would not find this comforting. The political right has its own version in the rhetoric of cultural decline, civilizational decay, and the corruption of traditional values by progressive ideology. This is also a form of moral realism, and like its counterpart on the left, its only contribution is the articulation of what's gone wrong. Both the progressive critique and the conservative lament share the plight of the Underground Man. They know what's wrong because they can feel it, but they don't know what to do. They can identify the false god, but they can't orient towards the true one because they don't know where to look. As a consequence, they have both become so performative that the facade of moral seriousness has almost hidden the lack of moral action. The tweet is substituted for the deed, just as the manifesto is substituted for the change, and the denunciation for the repair. Dostoevsky had an intimate understanding of this psychological dynamic, and could see clearly what happens when the conscience that has lost its theological anchor floats free as our performance. His insight was deeply personal, not just philosophical, honed from his time on the inside of the struggle. He could recognise these tendencies in himself and others, learned through a lifetime of profound suffering. After his mock execution in 1849, he spent 4 years in a Siberian prison camp. He suffered a gambling addiction, epilepsy, and constant financial debt, living through the mindset of the Underground Man before overcoming it. Afterward, he found no absolute certainty, just faith centred on endurance and perseverance. More than a theoretical construct, the Underground Man is a self-portrait of his creator, representing a version of Dostoevsky's own consciousness before his spiritual transformation. Unwilling to make the turn toward hope or transcendence, he's a mind trapped in a basement. I think this is the strongest reason why the translation of Zloy as spiteful rather than wicked matters so much. If the Underground Man is spiteful, then he's psychologically damaged. It's a quirk, something to analyse, diagnose and treat, and perhaps medicate. But if he's wicked, then he's corrupt at the level of theological reality. He's morally disfigured, his will turned in on itself so that he rejects the good even while recognising it, in turn rejecting the God whose image he bears. Notes from Underground clearly favours the second translation. Dostoevsky presents the problem as a fundamentally spiritual one, which is itself a form of moral realism, a refusal to accept the secular culture's preferred substitution of the psychological for the spiritual. As Dostoevsky leads us to understand, the underground man's conscience is the voice of God, although he refuses to believe this voice has any divine source or purpose. His response is a mixture of irritation and fear, as if it were a creditor he can't pay but can't run away from. He can't silence his conscience, but nor can he satisfy its demands. He can only talk about it, reflecting and analysing in circles from the underground. Here we find another contemporary relevance, as modern therapy culture often makes the same substitution that the Zelo translation enacts. Moral problems become psychological ones, and spiritual problems become behavioural ones. We have become extraordinarily skilled at describing the psychology of the underground man from the outside, and there are a whole host of modern labels available to us. Maybe he has a narcissistic personality structure, or avoidant attachment, or self-sabotaging defense mechanisms. Despite the specificity of these diagnoses, naming the condition doesn't necessarily change it, and the underlying problem remains untouched. The underground man himself will be the first to recognise this, as he is already the most sophisticated analyst of his own pathology. Naming it has never been the problem. The problem is the absence of a healing framework and a vision of the self as oriented towards something beyond. Without that higher purpose, there's no point in transformation because there's nothing to aim for. While the therapeutic model treats the underground man as a dysfunction to be adjusted, Dostoevsky insists that he's a sinner to be redeemed. And as we see in the translation error, it's a crucial distinction, because it determines what kind of solution you go looking for. There are a few key moments in the novel where the underground man appears to be self-aware, but his cynicism keeps him from noticing the one thing which would break him out of the cage he occupies. During his argument about primary causes, he pauses and says something that at first glance reads like self-deprecation. "Oh, gentlemen, perhaps I really regard myself as an intelligent man, only because throughout my entire life I've never been able to start or finish anything. Granted, I'm a babbler, a harmless, irksome babbler, as we all are. But what's to be done if the sole and express purpose of every intelligent man is babble? That is, a deliberate pouring from empty into void." Here we see the impotence produced by his philosophy, and can extrapolate the same general impotence that Dostoevsky is suggesting is produced by that of modernity. There's no end to the underground man's talking. He describes, analyses, and deconstructs endlessly, exposing the inadequacy of every available system. But the one thing he can't do is create. Words are where he stops, and he can't move from the word about the thing to the thing itself. The biblical tradition understands language as the instrument of creation. "In the beginning was the Word," John writes, and the Word is the creative act by which the world also comes into being. Also known as the divine logos, it's the fabric of the world itself, the blueprint seen unfolding through time as actuality. And the human capacity for language, for the word that names and calls into being, is one of the primary ways in which humans are made in the image of God. As I talked about in an earlier video, Tolkien argued that we are sub-creators. In his theological aesthetics, when we make things with words, we bring worlds into being. The underground man's babble is the perfect parody of this idea. Nothing follows from his word. It's anything but creative, and his endless talking produces nothing and changes nothing. He is aware of this and describes it as a deliberate pouring from empty into void. With such a precise description, you'd think he would be able to rectify it, to make something of his ideas. But no. He is trapped in the infinite regress of the meta, with each level of reflection becoming more sterile and further from the real world than the last. This has a striking philosophical resonance with Wittgenstein, who wrote that not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. This is the question the underground man doesn't know how to ask. In his philosophy, there's only room to ask how. How should I act? How should society be organised? How do I form my moral opinions based on the world around me? But the one question that precedes all of these, the question of why there is anything rather than nothing, of what it means to be a being who finds himself in a world he didn't choose and can't unmake, holds the key to the ground he's missing. The Crystal Palace doesn't have the answer, and neither does the underground. He's so caught up in the dichotomy of two opposing ideas that he's lost the ability to see beyond the paradigm of competition. The question he needs requires something from outside the system, something that tradition calls revelation. Dostoevsky is drawing a link here between the underground man's paralysis and his modern philosophical outlook. His inability to act is connected to his inability to find a first principle or a foundation. He doesn't have a secure attachment to the world, somewhere he can go out from and come back to, as a mother is to a young child when he's taking his first steps. He tells us that, "For me, every primary cause immediately drags with it yet another, still more primary one, and so on ad infinitum. This is the inevitable product of a philosophical method that has dissolved the ground it stands on. Without a foundation, no first cause or axiomatic truth, then every attempt to establish a basis for action will regress infinitely and produce only more questions. Without a stopping point, certainty is impossible, and his intellectual skepticism ultimately leaves him psychologically paralysed. This is a restatement of the oldest argument in the philosophy of religion, the cosmological argument, which asks the most fundamental question: why is there anything at all? Leibniz formulated it as why is there something rather than nothing? And every attempt to answer this question uncovers either an infinite regress of causes, which answers nothing, or a first cause that is not itself caused, which is what the tradition calls God. The underground man knows he's trapped in the former, and can't break out of it by his own intelligence. He's trapped in the paradox of an endless fall to a floor which doesn't exist. His philosophy prevents him from receiving the ground, from noticing anything outside his own mind. The Christian tradition that Dostoevsky draws on does not argue towards God as a logical conclusion, but receives him as a given. Writing much later, the philosopher Wittgenstein put it this way: not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. Without God, questioning wouldn't be possible in the first place because he's not a hypothesis to be confirmed or denied, rather the condition of there being any evidence at all. The underground man doesn't have the tools to confront the sheer, inexplicable, unchosen fact of existence. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, in After Virtue, made a similar argument about the condition of modern moral discourse. He described contemporary ethical debate as the equivalent of a civilization that has survived a catastrophe that destroyed scientific knowledge. For example, people still use the words neutron, mass, and velocity, but they have lost the theoretical framework that gave those words their meaning. They have the vocabulary without the system to understand it. MacIntyre argued that modern moral discourse is exactly like this. We have the words good, right, justice, and duty, but the theological and metaphysical framework has been lost. The way we understand human nature, telos, and the good towards which we are oriented, was the bedrock of morality for millennia, and the way we understood what those words mean. Without this, our culture is left to an endless spiral of an unsolvable moral argument, where people use the same words to mean different and incompatible things, with no shared basis for resolving the disagreement. The underground man is the perfect embodiment of MacIntyre's catastrophe. Like our culture today more broadly, he's missing the framework to really understand what he's saying. And because of it, his words are truly empty. They name nothing that they can act on, and refer to nothing that can serve as a foundation. He is intelligent, possibly brilliant, yet totally unable to use his gift for anything except the description of his own paralysis. And as Dostoevsky is suggesting, that's exactly the same holding pattern that modernity's intelligence is stuck in. MacIntyre's argument is that the recovery of genuine moral discourse requires the recovery of a shared account of human nature and human ends. For him, the only Western tradition that can provide this account with enough depth and internal coherence is that of Aristotle, which was developed and transformed by Aquinas and the Christian theological inheritance. This is the same argument that Dostoevsky is making. The underground man doesn't understand his why. He has no telos, no secure basis from which to act. He has no account of what human flourishing looks like that could orient his intelligence toward a tangible good. No account of what he stands for, just a laundry list of what he stands against. The resulting babble doesn't take away his IQ points, but it certainly does render him incapable. There is another important layer to the underground man's character that we haven't talked about yet. His endless self-referential analysis is, among other things, a parody of the Romantic and then realist traditions in Russian literature. Dostoevsky is engaging with the superfluous man archetype, the intellectually brilliant but emotionally paralysed aristocrat who appears in writers such as Turgenev and Pushkin and Goncharov. He can't engage meaningfully with the world. He's detached because he can always see through everything. Dostoevsky takes this literary type more seriously than his predecessors, going deeper into his inner consciousness and exploring the full philosophical implications of this mindset. The superfluous man represents a spiritual condition. He is isolated, not by society but by the result of his own choices, coming to believe over time that every action is compromised and every commitment limits freedom. For him, turning ideas into action means sacrificing infinite possibilities. As a result, he refuses to commit, preferring the purity of Babel over the impurity of creation. In Dostoevsky's theological vision, this is a version of the original sin. The underground man is the creature who refuses to be created, who denies what was given to him and closes himself off from the sources which lie outside. He aims to be perfectly self-sufficient, without realizing that his ego is obscuring the light he can't receive. He's cut himself off from the ground that could sustain him, and wondering why he can't stand up. The underground man has a theory of the false god. It appears in a passage about what human beings actually want, as opposed to what the Crystal Palace's designers think they want. It goes, "This prophet is remarkable precisely because it destroys all our classifications and constantly shatters all the systems elaborated by lovers of mankind for the happiness of mankind. It interferes with everything, in short." But this isn't the kind of economic profit we're used to thinking about. It's the profit of the will, the gratification that comes from making a choice and seeing it through, despite what the calculation says you should choose. The underground man is correctly arguing that this profit of the will is integral to human nature, and that we will often sacrifice our rational self-interest in its favour. Time and again, we will choose destruction over the Crystal Palace, and we will put the larger whole at risk for the sake of our own ego. And he's arguing that this is perfectly rational. It's the assertion of the furthest edges of humanity that the architects of the Crystal Palace have decided are too complex to take into account. But at this point, the argument turns against itself, and Dostoevsky's theological vision becomes most obvious. When the underground man has decided that will can't be reduced to the rational, that there's something deeply human that will always shatter the walls of the Crystal Palace, he's right. What he's wrong about, or rather what he can't fully grasp, is what that thing is, and what it should be aimed at. He makes an accurate assessment of the false god of utilitarian rationalism, but he replaces it with the only other god he knows, the will itself. He tells us that one's own free, unfettered choice, one's own whim, however wild, one's own fancy, worked up sometimes to a frenzy, that is the most profitable of all profitable things. This is a small, individualistic version of our modern predicament. The Enlightenment dismantled the authority of traditional religion and traditional moral order, and then the Romantic reaction restored the authority of the individual will. Dostoevsky saw the result with the kind of prophetic wisdom that permeates all his works, and showed it to us in the underground. In the dark depths, we look upon the will cut loose from any object outside itself, feeding on its own assertion, and paralysed by the knowledge of its own pure potential. In his work Sources of the Self, Charles Taylor describes modernity as having produced what he calls the expressivist understanding of the self. This is the idea that the authentic self is discovered through expression, of looking inward to project outward. It totally misses the point of orientation towards the greater good, towards something outside itself, and it's what the underground man represents. He expresses himself continuously, taking the expressionist self to its logical limit, and he does so with wit and intelligence. But the self ends up in a blank void, because it never acknowledges the reality of anything outside of it. It has nothing to express except its own wanting. It should be obvious to us that wanting without an object is just noise. The contemporary relevance of this is difficult to overstate. The political and cultural landscape of the 21st century is saturated with just the flavour of liberation that the underground man embodies. Every external authority is rebuked, along with every received moral framework. The claim to individual freedom outweighs the claim to his logical counterpart, responsibility. There's nothing left to bind and temper choices, and the slippery slope to wickedness is inevitable. This liberation presents itself as freedom, the opposite of the underground man's condition. But what he knows, and what Dostoevsky is showing us, is that this liberation and the underground are the same place. Without the ties to anything external, the self has nowhere to go and no moral direction to take. As such, the sole organising principle of life produces the same paralysis that we see in the underground man. The pernicious babble and the pouring into the void are one and the same as what's happening in our culture right now. It's time to get a little more precise about exactly which parts of our culture share the pathology of the underground man, because it's easy to point the finger in the wrong places. This is not exclusive to the political left or right. One form of this malaise is the progressive rhetoric of liberation from tradition, where received moral norms, inherited identities, and the claim that something outside the individual has any authority over it are denounced. Another form is the populist rhetoric of authentic self-expression against corrupt elites, where the politics of resentment that mistakes the identification of enemies for the possession of truth overruns the social climate. Both are versions of the underground man's logic, because they both offer the refusal of a false god without the orientation toward a true one. Both produce people who can see through it all and yet choose none of it. In place of the good society or the upstanding citizen, we have an endless articulation of what is wrong with everything else. The underground man himself would recognise both. Aware of the absurdity of this, he tells us, "One other circumstance tormented me then, namely that no one else was like me, and I was like no one else. I am one and they are all, thought I," which shows what a young pup I still was. Despite his moments of what seems like real self-awareness, he still can't see himself clearly. Self-awareness ungrounded in the external is just another form of isolation. From the underground, you can see the shadowy parts of yourself very clearly, but you can't get out. The self that observes itself observing itself is still in the mirror, talking to itself as it fades into the blackness. Dostoevsky's argument has profound political implications. The rhetoric of liberation has shrouded our modern cultural landscape, mocking tradition, authority, and the old morality with an unmatched vigour. It presents itself as the progressive and compassionate position, and like the underground man's position, it contains genuine insight. Some forms of authority are oppressive, and some moral systems have protected power over justice. In this respect, the underground man's resistance is understandable, and Dostoevsky recognises that not every tradition or authority is worth preserving. However, the liberation from false authority is not the same as the possession of the real thing. When false gods die, true ones don't automatically rise to take their place, and the person who has been liberated from every moral claim, who has learned to identify all of these claims as disguised bids for power, they have been handed the underground and told its freedom. They can see through everything and can choose nothing. Their only available move is to pour from empty into void and call it self-expression. The second half of the novel shows the human cost of the underground man's worldview. He encounters Liza, the young prostitute whom he speaks to about love's redemptive power and the possibility of a different life. She makes the mistake of trusting him, and he humiliates her. Liza offers him exactly what his conscience longs for: connection, a place to be vulnerable, and love without pretense, but he's too wrapped up with himself to receive it. By now, this sequence of events should be familiar, because it's exactly what Dostoevsky is trying to tell us throughout Notes from the Underground. The man has made his own mind the centre of reality, playing it as theatre. She threw herself at my neck, he tells us, and what follows is a tragic account of cruelty without intent. The underground man knows exactly what he's doing, but his insight remains purely intellectual. Liza leaves, his grace is refused, and he sits in the dark. Dostoevsky's diagnosis is harsh yet compassionate, because he doesn't see the underground man's condition as a personal failure. It's a system error, compounded by the philosophical journey that his culture is in the middle of, and that many of the most intelligent and sensitive people of his time are taking with the best of intentions. Dostoevsky knows the Chernyshevskians, and he knows they're not bad people. They're just wrong, and the underground man is a perfect example of their logical conclusion. The Crystal Palace can't provide a rationally organised utopia, a happiness for all, because real people can neither be perfectly organised nor perfectly rational. What they can do is talk about those things, endlessly, from a basement in St. Petersburg. The underground man is wicked, in the true theological sense of the word. He is a creature who was made for the good, but has fallen from grace because he has turned his back on it. When he meets Liza, the human hand of hope is held out to him, offering a second chance, hope and real connection, and he denies it once again. He analyses his own choices and the destruction he invites with the same precision he applies to everything, but the clarity changes nothing. The underground makes not a man, only paralysis and babble and cruelty. The novel promises a solution without fully delivering on it, so we are left to fill in the blanks for our own lives. That solution is repentance, the Greek metanoia, the turning of ourselves to something outside, something bigger. Our solution won't be the same as that of the underground man, but we can learn from his mistakes and the chances he refuses. We can learn from his wounds, from the conscience that won't be silenced, and build a framework that can offer a remedy. Notes from Underground takes us on a journey through the nature of a deeply human problem, but it leaves open the question of what conscience ultimately is. Dostoevsky believed it was the voice of God in the human person, but that's a conclusion that the underground man can't reach. The gap between Dostoevsky's vision and the underground man's inability to embrace it is one of the novel's central moral tensions, and the distance between them is the most important moral space in 19th century literature.